So the title of today's presentation is Human Pose Estimation in Bed, Simulating Alternative Sensors in the Presence of Occlusion. And this is similar to my PhD proposal talk, but I've shortened things a bit to fit within the 30-minute mark. So here's hold on. Yes, I don't have, there we go, okay. Here's a COI disclosure. It's related to a project that I was involved with for a mobile manipulator that can assist people in environments like a bed. And this technology has been licensed to Hello Robot. Existing methods for human pose estimation in bed are relatively limited. We aim to accurately infer a full 3D human mesh of a person in bed, which can adjust for people of many different body shapes and generalize to a wide variety of poses and postures in bed. Human pose estimation is important for assistive robotics, among other applications. By estimating the person's pose, the robot can understand where to go. Here, a person commands a robot to move to their left knee. Now, if the robot could infer a person's pose to a high degree of accuracy, then it might be possible to automate some assistive tasks, like giving the person a bed bath. Here's the outline for the topics I'm going to talk about today. So first an introduction, then a couple sections of prior work, and then my ongoing work. So pose estimation of a patient in the hospital might enable clinicians to detect problems in advance. For example, to prevent bed sores. If the pose estimate is highly detailed and accurate, then we might be able to correlate subtle pose characteristics with various pathological patterns and avoid them. Pose estimation is also important for assistive robotics. If accurate enough, it might be possible to fully automate some assistive tasks, such as scratching a person's itch or giving the person a bed bath. But these are very hard problems. So the better the pose estimate, the more possibilities there are. But this problem is challenged by heavy visual occlusion due to things in the bed environment like blankets, medical equipment, and other materials like this overbed tray. There's a lot of ambiguity in this particular picture. I'm not even sure if you could hand label where the person's joints are in the picture shown. So our work looks at alternative ways for how to sense a person in bed in the presence of visual occlusion, and we introduce new ways for how people in bed are modeled. So how can we sense a person in bed? Well, many different ways. Past works have used RGB depth, thermal, pressure images, infrared selective light. There's almost as many modalities as there are papers on human pose estimation in bed. Each modality has its advantages and drawbacks, given the high degree of occlusion that's common in a bed environment. Our bed sensing system can collect data from most of these modalities. We mounted a frame onto the bed with cameras that face towards the surface of the bed. The Microsoft Connect 2 on the frame collects RGB depth and point cloud information. The thermal camera collects thermal images that can resolve some of the ambiguity of a person under a blanket using heat diffusion. We also placed a flat fabric pressure sensing mat on the surface of the bed to sense the person in bed. This produces pressure images. In comparison to cameras, a pressure image is much less sensitive to visual occlusion because blankets and clothing are pretty lightweight. So how can we use these sensor images for the problem of human pose estimation? Well, human pose estimation is a long-standing problem in the field of computer vision. There's hundreds of papers on the topic and many people working on it. So let's just take a look at a couple notable examples. One of the first off-the-shelf human pose estimation methods was the work by Schotten in 2011, which was released at the same time as the Microsoft Connect. This uses random forests to infer human joint positions from a depth image. Around 2015, the vision community shifted towards deep learning. For pose estimation, this means using convolutional neural networks on most image modalities. So a notable example of this is OpenPose, which superimposes a 2D skeleton onto a person in an RGB image. And a more recent work in human pose estimation is Vive, which infers a full 3D mesh onto a person in video feed. And the results are pretty compelling. One thing you'll notice is that some of these works represent the human with a skeleton, and others represent the human with a mesh. Generally, a mesh is a better and more detailed human model, and researchers are increasingly using mesh models for human pose estimation. For an assistive robot, a mesh offers a better representation of body shape and size. So for example, if a robot were to wipe over a person's chest, the knowledge of the surface profile of the torso would be better than just a couple lines connecting the skeleton. But all the past works for human pose estimation in the context of a bed use a skeleton. In contrast, we aim to infer a full 3D human mesh. Human pose estimation is usually formulated as a supervised learning problem, where we have some kind of machine learning model that extracts features from a sensor image and outputs a pose. And to train such a model, we need data. And for modern deep learning methods, we need a lot of data. Current methods and data sets for human pose estimation are largely focused on active poses. While great diversity exists among these, it's actually quite different from the resting poses that people usually assume. People spend much of their life at rest, and within that, like a third of their life is just spent resting in bed, often a lot more for people with disabilities and older adults. So our work explores that class of poses. So pose estimation in bed is actually quite different from the pose estimation problem that most computer vision works look at. Besides heavy occlusion, resting poses are a different class of poses than active ones, characterized by an absence of motion. So this requires a different kind of data set for training machine learning models. But unfortunately, very little data is available for human pose estimation in bed. We have a couple options for this. One is that we could collect a lot of real data, but this can be very time intensive. And it can also be infeasible to assign accurate ground truth labels on some poses due to the heavy occlusion like the one shown. So instead, we could generate the data in simulation where everything is observable. Depending on the simulation, it might be possible to collect the data very quickly. But this also requires building an accurate model of the bed environment, which is full of soft stuff. Soft objects are notoriously challenging to model, but with state-of-the-art physics simulators, it's actually possible to do it. So let's get some intuition for how we can generate this data in simulation. Artists have long studied humans at rest. So in these paintings, observe the lack of physical exertion and the absence of motion that characterize the subjects. We can create a simulation to produce poses with similar characteristics by using a ragdoll body and dropping it onto a soft bed. So a key insight in this paper is that people at rest can be modeled with ragdoll physics to find statically stable poses of the human body at rest. So in this work, we introduce a method that simulates bodies resting in a bed and produces synthetic sensor images. So here's an overview of the process. So first we generate a data set in simulation, then we use it to train a deep learning model, and then we deploy this model on an assistive robot. With an estimate of where the person is, the robot can then physically interact with them. All right, now I'm going to talk about the first section of prior work. So a key purpose of this work is to have robots help people in bed. So how can they help people? We explored how we could integrate a robotic bed with a mobile manipulator robot so that the robots can collaborate to provide better assistance. Equipping the robot with appropriate sensors is key to understanding the state of the robot and the state of the person in bed. Our first step in this was to see how we could make an electric bed into a robotic bed so that it could assist people. Autobed is a robotic bed that's based on an Invacare fully electric home care bed, which in normal operation can be adjusted to different configurations using this hand control pendant, which is shown. And we developed a hardware module to electronically control it, and the bed has 3 degrees of freedom: the headrest, the leg rest, and the overall height of the bed. Autobed also has knowledge of its own state to allow for feedback control. It uses sensors on the bed to provide information on the bed's configuration, such as the angle of the headrest of the bed. We also placed a pressure sensing mat on the surface of the bed to sense the person in bed. We then created a second version of the Autobed with expanded sensing capabilities, which I showed previously, and it's shown again here. And besides the bed state and the pressure mat, it also has these cameras mounted on the frame overhead. The vast majority of human pose estimation works have used camera images, but our work uses pressure images and builds on these. So let's compare pressure images to camera images. Generally, pressure images have lower resolution, and the encoding of light intensity versus pressure intensity is fundamentally different. There's also a different kind of ambiguity. Cameras have visual occlusion, whereas pressure images have ambiguity from parts of the body not touching the fabric mat on the surface of the bed. But we find that data-driven models that have previously been applied to vision modalities actually work pretty well for pressure images. Here, we estimated human pose from a pressure image to enable robot assistance in bed. For this, we used a very simple center of mass calculation from the pressure image to infer the pose. So it's shown with that green star for where the head is when it's wiping the face. And we integrated the Autobed with a Willow Garage PR2 robot so that the robots could collaborate to provide assistance. And here the PR2 reaches to wipe the face of a man with quadriplegia. While the robots are able to assist, they're actually unable to provide fully automatic wiping, in part because the estimate is insufficient. Instead, the man teleoperates the PR2 once it's close to his face. So we improved our human pose estimation method by using deep learning to infer a 3D skeleton model of a person in bed from a pressure image. And we do this in a configurable bed. So in the picture, the bed is in a seated configuration, and our model outputs a skeleton in a seated posture that the robot can use to move towards. Our deep learning methods employ CNNs for supervised learning, and we use an embedded differentiable human skeleton kinematics model to constrain the output to more physically plausible estimates. And here we show how the skeleton model can adjust for different sized people, but this work has a number of limitations. So all the data consists of supine and seated postures, which are relatively homogeneous. So in other words, the data is not very diverse. And the human representation also lacks detailed information. We only have sparse labels on 10 different joint positions. But what if instead of that, we had labels like this? This shows a full mesh with the body shape of a person, along with an overhead camera image showing the real person in bed. These blue people, these estimates seem pretty accurate, but actually they're not ground truth labels. They're pose estimates, and they're inferred using these pressure images. While the data in the pressure images is pretty low resolution, our improved method is able to infer pose and body shape pretty well. So now I'm going to show you how we do that in the second part. So we're able to do this with this method. So first we generate a large data set in simulation that has full ground truth mesh labels, and then we train a deep model that outputs a human mesh. And we use the simple human parametric model to do this. And unlike some of David's work, where the Lie groups can fit to people of an arbitrary number of limb sizes, the simple model is built to the statistical average of a number of people recruited in a study of normal body type. So our work for this includes the following contributions. First, a physics-based method to generate simulated human bodies at rest and produce synthetic pressure images. And we also publicly release the pressure pose dataset, which consists of over 200,000 synthetic pressure images with associated 3D human poses and shapes, and also a smaller testing set with real data from 20 people. We also present PressureNet, which is a deep learning model trained only on synthetic data that estimates 3D human pose and body shape given a pressure image and a gender. So here's a visual outline for this portion of work, an effort to make it easier to parse. Much of it consists of our method to generate data in simulation. So for this, we use two physics simulators, Flex and Dart, which I'm going to explain, and then I'll talk about our deep learning method, and finally I'll discuss the evaluation and the results. All right. Our objective for simulation is to get a large set of resting poses coupled with synthetic pressure images of sufficient fidelity to train a model for use on real data. We use a physics simulation to generate this training data, and we do this by dropping ragdoll bodies on the bed like shown. Let's try to understand how we generate this data. So first, we initially sample the pose and body shape randomly, and this provides an unprecedented variety of human poses and body shapes, which would be extremely challenging to collect in the real world. All right. Next, we find a resting pose by dropping this capsulized ragdoll body onto a soft bed and wait for it to settle. But this capsulized body is too rough an approximation to produce a realistic pressure image. So then we use a second physics simulation with a non-articulated human mesh to compute the pressure image. And this mesh representation has a finer profile of human features. So let's take a look at some examples from the data set. These comprise a variety of postures, including supine, lateral, prone, and many others in between. So this just goes to show some of the diversity in the data set. So here's a prone one, there's one on the left side. Okay. The next part of the outline is how we can use Flex, a physics simulator, for the problem. So let's get some intuition for how this physics simulation works. Flex was initially developed to simulate a variety of materials for video games. But unlike some simulators, such as those that use the finite element method, Flex uses position-based dynamics, and it runs on a GPU, so it's really fast. Now I'm going to repeat this simulation, and I'm going to expose the spherical particles that determine the underlying physical interactions. So each of these objects is made up of particles that are connected or constrained in some way. And here we show a close-up of the real pressure mat on the surface of the bed along with its simulated counterpart. Our model of pressure is based on particle penetration between these top two layers of particles on the simulated mat, which are this orange and blue layer. All right. Particle penetration is measured by the amount that a top layer orange particle sinks into the underlying four blue particles, like so. And we convert particle penetration into pressure image taxels using this quadratic sensor model, which we fit with optimization. So like most other sensors, our synthetic pressure mat needs to be calibrated, but along with the whole FleX environment. So why do we need to calibrate FleX? Well, the real bed has a fixed mattress compliance and a pressure mat that was calibrated from the factory. In contrast, our simulated bed has parameters to alter the mattress compliance and parameters to adjust the characteristics of the pressure sensor, but their values are initially unknown. So we need to adjust these parameters so that the simulated bed behaves as close to the real bed as possible. We calibrated our simulation environment using custom calibration objects, which are these 4 large capsules made of PVC pipes and 3D printed end caps, which are shown. So they're pretty large. We then recreated these in simulation, and we optimized the physics simulation of these objects to match the real objects on the sensorized bed. The pressure maps on the right show the data that we're trying to match. We used CMAES to perform this optimization, which is a derivative-free optimization method that could account for many variables, typically like 10 to 30. So this is kind of ideal for our case. I think we optimized like 14. So these optimized variables include spring constraints between the synthetic pressure array layers on the top of the bed. So there's all these springs connecting the orange and blue particles. And besides the mat, we also optimized the parameters for the soft mattress underneath for the softness of it, because that has is unordered conglomerate of particles. But besides FleX, we use another simulator, Dart, which we connect with FleX. And the reason that we do this is because FleX can't simulate articulated multi-body dynamics, but Dart, a rigid body multi-body dynamic simulator, can. So the capsulized person here is modeled in Dart, which links together the capsules and the articulated body on a chain, and then we use FleX to compute the forces from the pressure mat underneath, and then we apply these to the capsules in Dart, and we run these simulators in sort of a loop. Now we can dig in to see how this works mathematically, but we don't have a lot of time today, so I think I'm just going to skip most of this explanation. So we use this spring mass damper model in the bed, and here's some of the physics equations. I'm gonna skip over this, but we can ask questions if there's more time. So because there's 2 simulators, we also have to calibrate them separately. So here we calibrate DartFlex, which is the combination of Dart and Flex. And we calibrate this after calibrating all of the Flex terms, which I previously discussed. So there's the spring coefficient in the DartFlex environment K, which we solved with this deterministic equation, and then we empirically set this damping coefficient B to promote simulation stability. All right, now I'm going to discuss PressureNet, which is the deep model that we use to learn from synthetic data. So using a large set of synthetic data, we trained PressureNet, this deep learning model that inputs a pressure image and a gender, and it outputs a human mesh estimate. PressureNet consists of 2 modules, each of which contain a CNN, an embedded simple human model, and this novel PMR component. PMR stands for Pressure Map Reconstruction. This component differentiably reconstructs pressure maps, which promotes consistency between the input and the output of the network. And to do this, PMR measures the distance that the underlying human sinks into the bed. Here we show PressureNet in action. So this first stage computes this quartz estimate, which doesn't quite match up with the ground truth. And then based on the spatial residual between the original pressure image and the reconstruction in purple, Module 2 fine-tunes. Here I'll discuss how PressureNet is evaluated using both synthetic and real data sets. So our synthetic data set has over 200,000 pressure images with associated resting poses, which we created for this evaluation. And we've also publicly released this data set, along with tools to get started and visualize it. Here we show the data bins that are used to evaluate PressureNet. We trained on synthetic data, and we tested on both synthetic and real data. One thing to note is that we found that roughly 2% of the synthetic data has uncomfortable or infeasible poses, such as these, which look contorted and impossible in some cases. Some of this could be caused by using hard limits in the joint angle space, and our work could be improved upon by using a joint angle dependency model for the human joint limits. We collected data from 20 people in a sensorized bed in both prescribed and participant-selected poses. Most of them, 48 per person, were prescribed, such as the one shown here, where we displayed a pose on a monitor, and we told the person to get into that pose. We also collected participant-selected, which I'll discuss in a later slide. So here we show the information that's available in the real data set to compare on. We have the pressure image, we have RGB, and a point cloud. We infer the human mesh from the pressure image, and then we use the point cloud to compute the error of the estimated mesh, because we can compare a mesh to a point cloud. And our last subsection of part 2 presents the results. Here's some results in supine postures. So the network has some ability to infer poses that are extending off the bed. Here's more results: the legs sideways, the knees bent, crossed legs. So notice how there's little information available on the left arm of the person on the left, and the network has some trouble inferring it because the arm's way off the bed. So hands behind the head, prone with the hands up, so the ones with the person lying on their arm, right lateral postures, left lateral. Yeah, some more examples. Here's a size comparison showing the smallest and the largest person in the data set. So I like to think that this shows that our network can infer a wide variety of different body shapes. These pictures show some failure cases. So here's a person that's flipped upside down. Here's interpenetration of a joint. So the ones on the right side then show where there's not a lot of information available, such as when the person's hands are on top of their chest. They're just not touching anything, so it screws up in these kinds of cases. We also have some failure cases when testing on the synthetic training data, and this lends to the notion that some failures may be due to the model's inability to extract information rather than overfitting. And we ran a number of ablation studies, such as ablating the PMR component in the network. We also tested for calibration noise on the input images and some other factors, and we used a mean per joint position error metric on the synthetic data because it was observable in the ground truth, as well as vertex to vertex error. And we also compared it to our real data using this 3D vertex point to error because the mesh can be treated like a point cloud in this context. Great, so now I'm going to discuss some of the ongoing work. So some of our ongoing work includes that we aim to create a synthetic data set with depth and point cloud vision data. Then we will explore methods for fusing multimodal information, and we plan to apply this to enable robots to provide assistance to people with disabilities. So why should we use vision data? So for assistive robotics, higher pose estimation accuracy is better, and using only a pressure image limits our potential. So for example, vision information would be better for body parts that aren't touching the pressure mat. And also, if the robot were to manipulate other objects in the scene like blankets, then the pressure image would not provide this kind of information. You would want to get the blanket information from an RGB or a depth camera or something. So to create synthetic vision data, we use FleX to dynamically model occlusions on the person in bed, such as the blanket that's shown here. And we also explore ways to cover the person with a blanket to mimic a real environment. Then we'll simulate a depth camera facing the person in the bed, such as this Connect 2 that's mounted from the perspective of being on the head of a robot or from maybe on top of the bed. Yeah, and so here's some more data that's shown in this simulation. All right, so in this case, first we would rest a person in the bed. This is the same as the second physics simulation that I showed earlier. Then we'll freeze the particles for the human in the bed, and we'll position a blanket above it, and then we'll drop it on them. And notice how that it covers their head in kind of this undesirable way that probably wouldn't be likely in the real world. So we can adjust the blanket to tuck it in or employ other kinds of strategies like this. So let's watch a video of this example. So first we drop the person on the bed. Good. We freeze the particles, and then you can drop the blanket on them. Great. And pull it back. All right, and so here we depict a depth camera from a couple different perspectives in simulation, the robot view and also a fixed overhead view. And we aim to apply our human pose estimation methods for robot assistance. So first we'll compare our work to a previous work with a robot that reached task relevant locations on a person's body. But the system in the previous work had limited capability for pose estimation, so our work will enable reaching to more locations on more diverse body poses, shapes, and human postures. And I thank my PhD committee members as well as my collaborators on this work. And I guess now I'll take questions.